Okay, welcome to Unit 6, Protection. I teach this a little different than most anatomy and physiology teachers. A lot of people start the year off talking about the integumentary system, but I like to save it for now because Unit 6 is all the things related to protection, like I just said, and that is what the integumentary system is all about. So, what is it? It is your skin and then all its accessories or appendages is what we really refer to them as, your skin appendages. So that would be things like glands, hair, and nails. The main function is protection, which is why I think it fits so perfectly in this unit. It does do so many other things though, which we will get into. We're going to kind of dive into the structure and how the structure dictates its function, which is protection. And then at the end of the notes, we'll come back to functions and talk about these a bit more. But your skin synthesizes vitamin D. It helps with regulating body temperature, balancing your bodily fluids, sensations. We'll talk about these sensory receptors you have in your skin that help your body process stimuli from the environment. And also, they aid a little bit with excretion, which is something we talked about mainly in our last unit, Unit 5, absorption and excretion with the urinary system. But your integumentary system plays a small role in that as well. Your skin is your largest organ. Its surface area can range anywhere from 1.2 to 2.2 square meters. So that is very large. And it's your body's first line of defense against any sort of invaders or other environmental factors that could have a negative impact on homeostasis. So even something like extreme temperature. It doesn't just have to be a pathogen like a disease-causing bacteria. But your skin's that first line of defense, and that's super important. So let's talk about its structure. Your skin basically has two main layers. Now, some will say three, but technically the third one isn't considered part of the skin, which we'll get to. So the two main layers are your epidermis and your dermis. Your epidermis is just this very top part. It is composed of epithelial tissue, which if you don't remember the different tissue types, you can go back to Unit 1, Intro to Anatomy, Concept 3, which was anatomy basics, and we did a little intro to histology there. So it's made of epithelial tissue, and it's getting all of its nutrients from the layer beneath it, which is the dermis. So your dermis is the workhorse. That's pretty much where all of the main stuff is going down. It's made mostly of dense connective tissue. It's the majority of our skin, like I said, and you can see how much stuff is inside of it. This is where our blood vessels are that are bringing blood with nutrients and taking out waste. There's glands, there's hair follicles, there's nerves. There's so many things. So if you're in my class, I want you to have out your big body diagram of the integumentary system and be labeling it as we kind of go through each one of these in much more details. But go ahead now, make sure you label epidermis and dermis, and then label those blood vessels. Okay, let's talk more about the epidermis and its structure specifically. When we're looking at the epidermis, it's basically made of 4 types of epidermal cells. So the main ones are keratinocytes. These produce keratin, which is a protective protein. They are on the surface of your skin and all throughout. The ones on the surface of your skin, though, are actually dead. And we lose so many of them every day that we basically shed our entire epidermis every 4 to 6 weeks, which is crazy. So if you don't wash your sheets that often on your bed, you probably should, because your entire epidermis is, shedding off. Maybe not all in your beds, probably in the shower some too and things like that. But that's a lot of dead skin cells. All right, another type of cell are your melanocytes. These produce melanin, which is a pigment that protects the nucleus of these keratinocytes from UV radiation damage. So we can kind of see in this picture, one down here, and then these little dots that are shown in this diagram are the melanin, which they are producing. Melanocytes are also what give our skin its color. We actually all have the same number of these types of cells, but the color of our skin varies based on the amount of these like cellular extensions you can see that they have, and how much melanin those extensions contain in them. So that's what's going to determine the different colors of our skin. Keratin, which is a yellow slash orangish pigment in some plant products, and hemoglobin, which is the protein in our red blood cells, those also are going to contribute to your skin color, like if you have really, really naturally rosy cheeks, things like that. But the melanocytes are really the cells that are giving us that phenotype of whatever our skin color may be. Then we have dendritic cells, also known as Langerhans cells. These ingest foreign invaders and play a huge role in activating our immune system. Specifically, they have a very significant role with getting T cells and our adaptive immune system activated. So we're going to talk about dendritic cells again in concept 3. You're going to see so much overlap between these 3 concepts compared to what we normally see, because they just are so integrated. And there is a picture of what one looks like there. It also has these cellular extensions. And then tactile epithelial cells, which are also known as Merkel cells. These sit where the epidermis and the dermis meet. So they're going to be down here. And they combine with the nerve endings that of the nerves that are in our dermis, and they make sensory receptors for touch, which we are going to talk about towards the end of this when we talk about the other functions of the skin other than protection. Okay, so that's the 4 types of epidermal cells. Now let's talk about the layers, the actual layers. You can probably see the layers of this just in this picture. So those gray words are all the ones we've already labeled. I wanted to keep them there for reference, but you've already written those down, hopefully. So your epidermis is divided up into 4 or 5 layers, and the number of those layers, whether that's 4 or 5, depends on if we're talking about thick skin versus thin skin. So if you think about your body, where do you have thicker skin? Well, you have it in places that are more prone to abrasion. So like the palms of your hands and your fingertips and the soles of your feet. And so your thick skin has the 5 layers, and then thin skin, which is pretty much everywhere else, has the 4. Okay, so first we're going to start from the most superficial layer and work deeper. So the stratum corneum, this is also known as the horny layer. It's anywhere from 20 to 30 cell layers thick of those dead skin cells, those dead keratinocytes. And they're bound super tightly together, and they help prevent water loss from the skin, and then also just create a really protective layer for the other layers below it. All right, just deep to that is our stratum lucidum. This is a clear layer. It's not pictured here, and it's because this is the layer that would only be in thick skin. So like in your hands and the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. So this is that layer number 5. It's just a really, really thin band of flat, dead keratinocytes again, and it's just beneath that stratum corneum. That's all. All right. Then we have the stratum granulosum, or the granular layer. It's about 1 to 5 cells thick. You can see it here in this picture. It's showing 3 layers of cells. And this is where our cells fill with keratin. So we have our keratinocytes down here. They'll make their way up, and this is where they actually are filled with keratin. And this layer is very tough, and it's also water resistant. And so all of the cells above this layer are too far from our dermis. Remember, our dermis is providing all of our nutrients in the capillaries that are in the dermis to survive. So that's why they're basically all dead, because they're cut off from nutrients up there. All right, the stratum spinosum is here. This is our prickly or spinous layer. It contains intermediate filaments that help to resist tension, and the dendritic cells are the most abundant in this layer. And then the deepest layer of the epidermis is the stratum basale. This is the basal layer, and it's usually just a single row of stem cells attached to the dermis, and that's where all of our new cells are made. So because this is where we're getting a lot of the new cells, sometimes it's referred to as the germinating layer, and this is where our youngest keratinocytes would be, and then they get older and older and older the closer you get to the surface of the skin. Okay, that's the epidermis. Let's talk more about the dermis. It's a little bit simpler. It basically has two layers. One of those is the papillary dermis. This is made of areolar connective tissue, which is interwoven loosely with collagen, elastic fibers, and then, of course, blood vessels. And one of the important features of this is something called the dermal papillae. These are projections from its surface, which aren't pictured very well in this at all, that kind of go into the epidermis. And so think of it as like a little like squiggly line you could draw. And these projections, these papillae contain capillary loops and nerve endings and touch receptors that kind of can like innervate the epidermis. And then the other part of the dermis is the reticular dermis, which is made of dense, irregular connective tissue. And that's where the majority of the blood vessel network is. And there's thick bundles of collagen fibers there too, and that gives the dermis a lot of strength and resiliency. So in our thick skin, like your fingertips and the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet, like we talked about, these dermal papillae actually lie on top of dermal ridges, which form ridges in your epidermis, which you can see. Like if I look at the skin on my forearm, for instance, it's just super smooth. Whereas I look at my fingerprints or the palms of my hands or the soles of my feet, I can see like all these different ridges. And so that's what these dermal papillae that create these ridges are also what give us our unique fingerprints, which is pretty cool. But again, this papillary dermis part, that's only 20%. The other like 80% of the dermis is that reticular dermis. Another interesting fact is these collagen fibers that run through the dermis run in various like planes. Mainly parallel to the skin surface, and separations between these kind of form cleavage, which creates tension lines in the skin that are invisible externally. Like I can't look at my skin and see what they are, but surgeons know where they run, and when they make incisions, they try to make them along those lines, those like cleavage lines, so that the skin will like gape less and then also heal faster, which I think is pretty fascinating. Okay, last but not least, we're going to talk about the hypodermis. Again, this is not technically part of the skin because it is superficial to the fascia, which is tough connective tissue that wraps around skeletal muscles, but I think it's still important to know it's this layer right here that's going to literally be pictured in every diagram of the skin anyway. So I want you to know what it is. It's often just referred to as subcutaneous tissue. Again, technically not part of the skin, but it's just mainly this layer of adipose tissue, which is aka fat. And it has important roles. It helps insulate against heat loss, storing energy, of course, because we know that's a huge role of our fat, helps absorb shock, and then also it's anchoring the skin to all of those underlying structures like the skeletal muscles that I mentioned. So it's really important, but again, technically not part of the skin. All right, let's keep talking about structures. And now we've covered the skin, which is the main part of the integumentary system. But now I want to talk about some of these skin appendages, or I like to think of them as accessories to the skin. So one of those is hair. Your hair is just long filaments made of those dead keratinocytes. That's all, just dead cells. The part that kind of sticks out of your skin is the hair shaft, and then the part underneath the skin would be your hair root. If we're looking at a hair cell like super zoomed in like we see here, there's kind of 3 layers to it. The medulla is the deepest layer. It's the central core. It's made of soft keratin. The cortex is kind of the bulky layer around that. And then the cuticle is like a single layer of overlapping cells. And the way they overlap kind of makes shingles on the roof. So if you have, fun fact about this, which is why I included this, your medulla, if you have super thin hair, or really fine hair, I guess I should say. So if like you actually like were to look at a hair strand and say that's really fine, you may not even have medulla in your hair, which is kind of crazy. And then you're probably the most familiar with the cuticle layer because conditioner is what helps smooth down these kind of like layers of overlapping cells to keep it nice and smooth and not looking crazy and to help with dead ends and things like that. That's all related to the cuticle here. Okay, a couple other structures that I want to label here before we move on are the hair bulb, which is in the hair follicle. So that's kind of underneath the skin. We're going to talk about this on the next slide. This part, which is called the root hair plexus, and then the dermal papillae, which we talked about, or that, the singular form, dermal papilla. That's just one of them there. We talked about on the last slide. Remember, that's the part of the dermis that kind of can go up into it and embed it with a capillary or a nerve ending or something like that. So I just wanted you to label those parts. And then erector pili, that's a muscle we're going to talk about in just a second. So that part of the structure. So make sure you label those. Okay, let's talk more about the hair follicle. So we're going to go under the skin here. These are tubular invaginations in the epidermis that your hair grows out of. The deep end of the root, so remember everything under the skin is the root, but the deepest end we call the hair bulb. And then the erector pili, that's this smooth muscle cell bundle that's going to contract, and that is what causes your hair to raise upright. So if you get goosebumps or you're cold, anything like that, that muscle is what is going to raise your hair. Okay, the root hair plexus. This is also known as the hair follicle receptor, so we'll mention it again at the end of the notes. This is nerve fiber endings that perceive touch and wrap around each bulb. So like you can very lightly brush your hair on your arm with your finger without touching your skin, and you can feel that and sense that because you have these nerve fiber endings. That's pictured there. And then we mentioned before the dermal papilla. This has capillaries that supply the hair with the nutrients they need, and it also signals growth. Hair grows because cells in your hair bulb of the follicle are dividing rapidly and making new hair cells, and that's what keeps pushing them upward and outward. So the part that's like sticking out, remember, is dead, but they're new cells being made down here. And each follicle goes through a growth cycle that has an active growth phase versus like a resting growth phase. And the length of these varies in different parts of the body, which is why, you could cut off the hair on your head and shave the hair on your legs and it would grow back at different rates. If you've ever heard of like laser hair removal, you have to do it in these like 4 to 6 week rounds several times so that you kind of get every round and every phase of the hair removed. That's something we'll investigate a little in class. Okay, one last thing, which I just think is interesting, so I want to share with you. The shape of your hair follicle is what's playing a really major role in the actual texture of your hair. So if you notice these hair follicles down here, notice the angle of them is all different, and then that's affecting how the hair shaft is essentially bending. So the flatter the follicle, the curlier the hair will be. So like the more it's like laying down sideways. So if it's straight up and down, you're going to get straight hair. It's kind of tilted, you'll get wavy, and then the flatter it is, the more curly it will be. That's what it's looking like as well. I thought that was fun. All right, let's talk about your nails. These are made of heavily keratinized cells, and they basically have 3 parts. So we've got your root, which is embedded in your skin, the plate and body, the nail body, and then your free edge, which is the part you trim. Your nails rest on part of the epidermis called the nail bed. So that's what we refer to, that skin under there. And your nails appear pink under the nail bed because there's so many capillaries under there in the underlying dermis that's there. And then your nail matrix is just where your nail grows. That's what it's referred to. Okay, last but not least in our structures specifically our appendages are the glands. So our skin has sweat glands that are mainly responsible for keeping us from overheating and regulating our body temperature, but we also have sebaceous oil glands that are mainly working to help prevent water loss. So looking at those sweat glands, there's 2 main types of sweat glands. We have our eccrine sweat glands, which are the most abundant. They're all over your body, essentially, and but you have more of them in your palms and your forehead and your soles of your feet, which makes sense. Because if you think about like if you're getting nervous or Like for me, I'm scared of heights. So if I even start thinking about skydiving or something like that, my hands get sweaty. Maybe the soles of my feet start to sweat. Those are those eccrine sweat glands. We have over 3 million sweat glands distributed throughout our body, which is kind of crazy. The only place you don't have sweat glands are on your nipples and then just parts of external genitalia, which is kind of interesting. So that's what an eccrine sweat gland would look like in a picture. We're going to see in a second, it's always going to have its sweat secretions, always going to come through a pore on the surface of the skin. But then we also have these apocrine sweat glands, and these are lying deeper in our dermis, and they're larger than eccrine. And they don't really develop or come in until puberty. And these specifically empty into hair follicles. So you can see it right here. See this sweat gland, how it's emptying into the hair follicle rather than the surface of the skin. And so these are located around your armpits and then your groin area. So your sweat is like 99% water and some salts, but there's also some nitrogenous waste from metabolism that can be released. And then also a peptide called dermicidin, that can kill microbes, which we'll kind of mention again later in concept 3. So your sweat is actually a little bit acidic. It's anywhere from 4 to 6 on the pH scale. And so that's one of the ways it helps with protection as well. There are 2 types of modified apocrine glands. The ceruminous glands that are in your ear canal, they make earwax, and then mammary glands in mammary ducts that secrete breast milk. So those are under this category, which I think is pretty interesting. Okay, so for labeling on your picture, that's where we would see a sweat gland. Specifically, you should know that this is which type of gland. It would be an eccrine one, because notice how it comes up through the pore. That's how you could identify the difference. We don't have in this picture, we don't have a picture of an apocrine one. And then there's an example of a sebaceous oil gland, which we'll talk more in a second. But again, notice the sebaceous oil glands also are attached to the hair. Okay, so we're going to differentiate between the 2 types of sweat glands and then the sebaceous oil glands on this chart. So first, let's talk functions. Your eccrine sweat glands, they are responsible for temperature control, and then they have some of those antibacterial properties we talked about with what they contain, like that acidity. What they secrete is sweat, which is mainly water, and where they secrete it is on the surface of the skin. So they're easy to identify under the skin because you should see them going all the way up to the surface. They are everywhere in our body, but we have extra in our palms and the soles of our feet, and then also our forehead. Apocrine sweat glands, we actually don't know exactly what they do, but because that they come up during puberty and because of where they're located, we think they may have something to do with like sexual scent glands and things like that. Their type of secretion is sweat also, but the sweat that they secrete is a little bit different. It contains proteins and fatty substances. And so when we secrete this sweat, bacteria that's like on your skin can react with these proteins and fatty acids that they're basically trying to decompose and break down. And then that's what can give you body odor, which is kind of interesting. If you've never noticed, like really little kids, like toddlers don't really have like BO at all, but once you hit puberty, you do, and that's because you start secreting this sweat that has these proteins in it and this fat that bacteria will start to decompose, bacteria on the surface of your skin, and give you that pleasant smell. This sweat is secreted usually in the upper part of a hair follicle. Rarely will they just secrete right onto the skin surface. So again, in the pictures, you're looking for it attached to a hair follicle. And where are they in your body? They're in your axillary, which is like your armpits, and then your anogenital regions of your body, which is around your anus and your genitalia, like the name suggests. And then your sebaceous glands. So these are responsible for lubricating and softening our skin and hair. They help to slow water loss, and then they also can have some antibacterial properties. They secrete sebum, which is an oily secretion. And again, it's usually out of a hair follicle as well. Sometimes they can just secrete right onto the skin surface. Where are they? Well, this is like those oily glands that can give you pimples. So think about where you can get pimples. Um, they're pretty much everywhere. A lot in your face and in your back, things like that. But they are not in your palms of your hands or the soles of your feet. All right. Told you I want to touch back on this one last time and then we'll be done. I know this got a little bit long. So we said the main function of our skin is protection. And it does that by creating barriers, physical ones, chemical ones, and biological ones. Okay, so physically, it's obviously just like a physical layer. It's a covering of your skin, and it's continuous and it has several layers to it. So it's just an actual physical barrier, like a semi-permeable wall around the rest of your body. But it also creates a chemical barrier. Your skin secretes natural antibiotics called defensins. And most of these secretions also have a low pH, which makes them a little acidic. So both of these things help with killing bacteria that are just on the surface of your skin. Also, melanin, we mentioned, made by melanocytes, is a chemical pigment in one of your epidermal cells that basically acts as a shield to protect against UV damage in your keratinocytes. So that's another way that our skin forms a chemical barrier to create protection. And then lastly is a biological barrier. So think bio means life. So immune cells are living. There are immune cells in your skin that help create a barrier and protect and help work with the immune system, so again, these will come up again in concept 3. We have the dendritic cells in the epidermis, which patrol beneath the surface. They help to capture any invading foreign substances and initiate an immune response. And then macrophages, that word literally breaks down to big eaters. In your dermis, they are part of your second line of defense in your body, and they'll also initiate an immune response if invaders make it through the epidermis and to the dermis and they catch them. All right, but like I said, your skin does so much more than just protection, even though that in and of itself is so much. Helps with body temperature regulation. When your body needs to lose heat because it's overheated, your dermal blood vessels, the blood vessels in your dermis, will vasodilate and expand, and then that will release sweat, which will cool your body down as it evaporates off the surface of your skin. If we need to retain or conserve heat, we'll vasoconstrict those blood vessels in your dermis, and that'll help keep heat from leaving the body. Your skin also plays a role in blood storage. Up to 5% of your body's blood volume at a time is just in your skin alone. So that's a lot of blood. We also said your body helps to synthesize vitamin D, and which its main role is to help the body absorb calcium, and calcium does so many things in our body. And we talked about vitamins and minerals like vitamin D and calcium in Unit 5, Concept 2. So you can go back and watch that one if you need to. And then excretion, which we again talked about a lot, mainly in Unit 5. But some nitrogenous wastes also get eliminated in your sweat. Again, the majority are released in your urine, but some do get released in your sweat as well. So it does aid in excretion a little bit too. So look at how many body systems we're interacting with too. We've talked about blood vessels and blood storage. So we're talking about cardiovascular system here. We're talking about absorbing calcium, which has huge roles for the muscular and skeletal systems, as well as a ton of other things. And then we're talking about excretion, which has to do with the urinary system. So many interconnections between all of these and the integumentary. And one of those big connections is with the nervous system. So one of your skin's really big functions is sensations, and using a bunch of different sensory receptors to take in and process stimuli from the environment and then send them to your central nervous system so your body can figure out what it wants to do. So I'm just going to touch on a couple here, not all of them. Tactile corpuscles, also known as Meissner's corpuscles, and tactile epithelial cells or Merkel cells, they can sense texture changes as well as slow vibrations. So you could, when there's clothing on your skin, you can feel when there's fabric on your skin, and that's because of these receptors, which are pictured here. Lamellar corpuscles or Pacinian corpuscles, they sense deeper pressure and faster vibrations. That's what one looks like. Your hair follicle receptors, or that root hair plexus we talked about when we were talking about hair follicles, that's what allows us to feel like if the wind's blowing in your hair, or like we said, if you can just brush along your arm hairs, that's what's allowing you to feel that. And then there's also just free nerve endings that are there to sense pain. And then Ruffini endings, which can sense stretching. And then the one I didn't go into is these Krauss end bulbs. They're only in specialized regions of the body, but they're also just mechanoreceptors that are sensitive to touch and pressure, like so many of these. And that was my much more long-winded than anticipated lecture on integumentary system.